There's a law that Tim Walz signed that says the court can take jurisdiction, which in this instance means custody, over minor children who are not getting the gender-affirming care, which is a lie. There's only two sexes. Gender's bullshit. There's men and there's women. One cannot become the other. And he signed a law saying that they can take jurisdiction over minor children who are not being affirmed by their children and get all of those procedures done outside of any connection. Your parents will have nothing to do with it. They won't have access to you.
Megyn Kelly and Tucker Carlson didn't hold back. When the cameras rolled and the spotlight fell on Tim Walz, they didn't warm up or ease into the criticism. They struck with sharp precision. The governor of Minnesota wasn't just caught. In a political misstep, he was called out for what both Kelly and Carlson described as a dangerous pattern of leadership. One rooted in confusion, fear, and a desperate need to appear virtuous while everything else fell apart. Tucker compared him to a discount version of Napoleon, a man obsessed not with conquering empires, but with collecting buzzwords and banning logic. And Megyn painted an even darker picture, warning about what Tim Walz's policies meant, not just for the state of Minnesota, but for the future of children, families, and truth itself. They began with the chaos that followed the riots. Minnesota didn't just tremble, it burned. And as the flames spread, Carlson highlighted how Walz reacted like a man sedated, checking horoscopes and waving softly into microphones while his state slipped into ruin. Instead of decisive action, Walz offered confused statements, long pauses, and empty reassurances. Carlson joked that Walz didn't handle the crisis. He watched it from a safe distance, probably while preparing for another listening tour. That's right, listening. Because instead of acting like a leader, Walz decided to ask the victims how they would have governed differently. As Tucker said, that's not leadership that's hiding behind the crowd you're supposed to protect. Megyn took it further. She zeroed in on Walz's policies around gender identity and children's health, and what she laid out was alarming. According to her, under Tim Walz's rule, the state of Minnesota had opened the door to procedures for minors' puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, even surgeries, all without parental consent. Megyn painted a heartbreaking picture of a young girl lost in the chaos of puberty, struggling through personal pain, and getting pulled into a dangerous online spiral. She warned that Walz's policies allowed the state to take custody, use Medicaid, and carry out irreversible medical interventions, all without the parents' approval. Her voice didn't shake with outrage. It was calm but loaded with disbelief. To her, this wasn't progress, was cruelty, packaged in soft language and masked as compassion. Tucker nodded, pointing out the weakness that made all of this possible. Walz, he said, was the perfect puppet for a system that rewards softness and punishes strength. He wasn't picked for his vision, but for his compliance. According to Carlson, Tim Walz is the kind of man you need when you want no resistance. A man who apologizes before taking a stand and then changes course based on the loudest voice in the room. Carlson called it the party of weak men and unhappy women. And that combination, he warned, doesn't build anything. It only ruins what others worked to protect. The conversation then turned to crime. Minnesota's streets, once seen as peaceful, were now filled with rising violence. Carjackings had become so common, Tucker joked, they were starting to replace ride-sharing apps. And how did Walz respond? He formed a task force. Not action, not reform, just more committees, more reports. It's more ways to look busy without doing anything. Carlson said it plainly. Tim doesn't want to fix anything. He just wants to look like he's fixing things. And while people feared for their safety, Walz blamed systems, held town halls, and avoided saying anything that might upset the wrong group. Megyn didn't stop. She brought the focus back to education. Under Walz, Minnesota's schools had become, as she described it, a chaotic experiment in emotional learning with no results to show for it. Reading, math, science, these were replaced with mindfulness sessions, coloring pages, and group therapy circles. Students weren't being prepared for the real world. They were being softened into confusion. Teachers were buried under regulations. Parents were left out of the conversation. And Walls. He was taking photo ops with mascots and tweeting about reimagining the classroom. Carlson added that reimagining in Walls's world meant turning classrooms into playrooms, with iPads and beanbags, places where nothing hard was ever taught and no child was ever challenged. Then came the faith moment. Walls quoted scripture in one interview, Matthew 25-40. To the least among us, ... double quotes, he began. But Tucker saw right through it. He mocked the moment, saying it was strange for a man who supported taking kids away from parents to quote the Bible on compassion. He suggested Walls used faith not as a guide, but as a shield, pulling it out only when it sounded nice, only when it could distract from the truth. Meghan agreed, adding that Walls's version of leadership seemed like a blend of emotional performance and administrative laziness. She said he governed like a man who read about problems in a book and tried to solve them using hashtags. From there, they tackled Walls's vision of public safety. Reimagining was the word used, a strategy so vague that Carlson joked it could have been written by an AI robot drunk on wine. It's the phrases he used: restructuring, accountability. Holistic partnerships, community-based policing meant nothing. They were empty, and Carlson said what everyone else was thinking. These weren't plans. They were buzzword collages designed to confuse critics and calm activists. Meanwhile, crime rose, trust fell. And neighborhoods once known for safety became places where parents were afraid to send their kids out after dark. And then came the media performance, the public image. Meghan rolled her eyes at the way Walls played the role of working-class dad. The rolled sleeves, the plaid shirts, the overly earnest facial expressions. She said it looked less like leadership and more like a bad episode of Undercover Boss. Walls didn't look like someone in charge. He looked like someone pretending to care while reading from a script he didn't even believe. She pointed out how awkward his body language was during public events. The strange hugs, the weird handshakes, the forced laughs. According to Meghan, it was all part of the act. But the problem with acts is they only work when the audience buys in. And more Minnesotans weren't buying it. Tucker jumped in with one of his most brutal comparisons yet. He said that watching Walls lead was like watching someone try to build a house using IKEA instructions translated from 5 different languages. Everything looked official, but nothing worked. There were words, diagrams, and even tools. But in the end, the roof still leaked, and the doors didn't close. That was the state of Minnesota under Tim Walz. Plenty of effort, no results. As the conversation continued, Meghan went back to the issue that hit her the hardest: the medical transition of minors without parental consent. She spoke emotionally about the idea of the government stepping in, taking custody, and approving irreversible procedures on kids who couldn't even legally buy a lottery ticket. She called it a betrayal of parenting, of science, and of basic human rights, and she blamed Walz directly. His signature on those bills, she said, wasn't just political, was personal. It meant families were being torn apart, not by crisis, but by law. Tucker wrapped it all up by returning to the theme of weakness. Walz, in his view, was the face of modern failure. Not because he was cruel, but because he was soft, because he said everything and meant nothing, because he listened too much too. People who wanted chaos and did too little for those who needed calm. He said that history won't remember Walz as a villain, but as something worse, an enabler. Someone who stood by while others destroyed what worked, and did it all with a smile, a slogan, and a nod to the crowd. In the end, both Meghan and Tucker agreed. Tim Walz wasn't just a bad governor. He was a warning, sign of what happens when leadership becomes theater, when empathy replaces action, when buzzwords replace logic, and when people stop questioning the calm voices saying the most dangerous things. Because when politicians, like Walz, are left unchecked, it's not just policies that break down its trust. families, schools, safety, and sanity. And that breakdown, according to both Megyn Kelly and Tucker Carlson, wasn't just visible in policy, it was deeply woven into the culture of fear and silence that had taken hold under Tim Walz's leadership. Tucker pointed out how dissent had become dangerous in Minnesota. Teachers, doctors, and even concerned parents were hesitant to speak out because they feared backlash. The political atmosphere was so charged that asking questions about public safety, gender policy, or education reform could get you labeled as hateful or misinformed. Megyn described it as a quiet purge of disagreement, where anyone who didn't align perfectly with the state's progressive narrative risked being shamed, silenced, or worse, targeted. They highlighted how the media played a role in enabling Walz. Instead of holding him accountable, reporters often treated him like a misunderstood hero, praising his inclusive language while ignoring the chaos around him. Megyn noted that journalists asked him soft questions during press conferences, barely scratching the surface of the real issues. No one challenged him on the rising crime rates, the declining test scores, or the explosion of bizarre administrative rules in public schools. And when someone finally did ask a tough question, Walz dodged it with buzzwords and vague phrases, then smiled like he'd just solved a national crisis. That was part of the problem. Everything looked polished, but nothing worked. And the press let it slide. Tucker then brought up one of the most disturbing outcomes of Walz's policies: the normalization of government overreach.